let's talk to Ray in the UK.
Ray, I feel like it's been a few weeks.
Yeah. Ray,
Hi.
welcome to the show. You want to talk about how to find reliable sources of information?
Yeah, there was a study just recently published that made me think about this more. They had paid regular Fox News viewers to watch 1 to 7 hours of CNN per week for 25 days. And even though they didn't actually stop watching Fox, it reduced the number of hours, but they were still watching it. Even that small amount actually significantly shifted their views on the top stories that month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the outlets I've seen, which are like independent news media, online stuff, who talk about this, they're really excited about it, obviously, because it's really good news. You can see it as really good news that people's minds can be changed, even if, like, they chose people who are very, very staunch Fox News viewers. And but they also would. The conclusion that people seem to be drawing is, well, then it seems people just believe whatever you put in front of them, so we just need to put the right information in front of them. But it doesn't really go into how do you make sure you've got the right information sources, because that's not what the study was about, really. Actually, the study was not really about what people are talking about it for. I have actually read it, and the whole paper, and that's a whole other thing that's kind of related to this, is how it was misrepresented slightly. But because of that, I'm now wondering, how do I know which are the best sources of information to choose?
Oh my gosh.
Reuters and Associated Press, and I've heard other people who think, people will throw out all these very famous outlets and say, oh, this one's respectable, but no one ever says why. And I don't know how to find out, like, in detail, okay, who funds this organization. Like, you can find that out more easily, that's quite easy. But the stuff about what are their procedures, how many consultants and specialists do they have per subject, how much time do they dedicate per subject, what's their accountability and quality control procedure, how do you find out if they're doing this thing that a lot of news media is apparently doing now, where they just scour Twitter because it's easier, and they just repeat what everyone else is saying instead of checking.
Yeah.
Ray,
how do you know that stuff?
Ray, I'm so excited about this, because this is actually something that there is an expert on this call who can talk about this. Somebody who's actually gone to college for this shit. V, please. Yes, this is it.
Oh my gosh.
I'm excited.
So, Ray, that's a really good and important question. And I can tell you, just from what I've heard people saying to you from this conversation, they're all kind of not answering it correctly. Like, they're not answering you right. There's a phrase that I love, and it's truth is an aggregate thing. Okay, there is no one source that you are going to be able to read that will give you the truth. In fact, even if you were to read all of the reporting from all angles on an issue, you're going to get closer to the truth, but you might not even get it then. And that feels fatalistic, but what I want to impress upon you, I can give you a couple of actual, like, hard things to actually do and, like, help with that. But first, I do want to make sure that I'm pointing out that there is no one place where the truth lives. There is no one source that knows things in a way that others don't, or is somehow not being infected by the same level of, social media scouring and misinformation that everybody else is, right? So definitely take into account when people are like, oh, this organization, does a lot of research and asks for peer review. Like, that's great. Definitely put that into your repertoire of things you're reading. But there is no one place to go for truth. And that's the sucky part. That's why being aware of what's happening in the world is so annoying, and why people on both sides of any political aisle prefer to just watch Fox News or just watch CNN, because it's a lot easier to get an idea of what's going on and, trick yourself, I guess, into thinking that you've got the whole story instead of actually doing the really hard work of actually knowing what's going on across the board. So there's that, first of all. How does that strike you?
It makes sense. Yeah, I don't like the idea of only having one source. And when it comes to, it's the current affairs and politics side of things that I feel out of my depth on. Mm-hmm. I do have stronger opinions on science reporting. My personal opinion on that is that I don't think I've never come across a single newspaper or TV show or anything that was accurate at reporting research papers.
Yeah.
They all get it horrendously wrong, sometimes innocently and not really importantly. And there are some really egregious examples I can remember from years ago that mean that now if I'm interested in what a paper actually said, I read the paper myself.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I dismiss the article. If I can't be bothered, then I just forget it, because I know there's such a good chance that it's actually misleading. And I don't know if that's something that people disagree with, because I'm not a professional scientist. So they might say, I might misunderstand the study as well. I might do, but at least that's in my hands then, because the mistakes I see being made are really, sometimes they're so shocking that I wouldn't make that mistake reading the study.
Right. And it's not always a mistake either. Like, that's the other part of it, unfortunately, is a lot of the time, it could just be that this science journalist who is hired and doesn't have a degree in, microbiology reads a paper and misunderstands it and misreports it. But a lot of the time, what ends up happening is they commodify it, right? We live in a world where the news is a business that needs to run itself by making itself interesting. And so nobody is going to read a story on a paper that says, we looked at some stuff, here are some numbers, it's not super conclusive, but here's a new idea that maybe another scientist at some other point in time will look at, right? That's the majority of papers, right? There are hardly any that are just like groundbreaking, oh my gosh, out of left field, this thing just happened and now we have the answers to life, the universe, and everything, right? So that doesn't make good news. That doesn't make a good news story. It's not good entertainment. And so a lot of the time, the way that they spin it is to sell it as opposed to report on it correctly. So I love the fact that you are reading the studies yourself. And I love the fact that you are thinking about, how am I synthesizing this? What am I understanding? What do I need background information on? One really good thing that you might want to do, and obviously this is only going to work if you have a area you are focusing on. We don't want to have you blow up all the time. But having Google alerts for certain words or phrases will help get those in front of you every day. So I was listening to an episode of Ologies by Ali Ward, shout out, and they were talking about ADHD and the studies that are happening on ADHD currently. There are about 45 papers a day that get pushed onto the internet from reputable scientists, from think tanks, from, organizations that are credible. And the only way you're going to find out about those studies is if you have that alert set. So if somebody publishes something about ADHD, you're going to get that alert on your phone, on your computer. It's super useful. I do it for a couple of things, just the things I want to keep an eye on. And that's going to make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date information, and all of it all at once, instead of only the things that journalists think are useful to report on, right? Because a lot of the times, of those 45 studies that happen every day, they might pick up one if it was interesting or relevant to another subject or seemed particularly inflammatory, but one of those other 44 might come at it from a different angle, or, address an issue that the study that they chose didn't even think about. And so that's why I'm saying there is no one area to go to for truth.
Okay, so let's put this in practice, right?
Yeah.
Let's say I find an article on Reddit that says that eating dark chocolate prevents Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like it's an article from a major, maybe a Washington Post,
Okay.
or just, I don't know, maybe an unknown source. But I'm like, V, because I've done this before.
Yes.
V, here's an article. I don't know how much weight to put in what it's saying. What do you do, and what should people do?
That's a really good practical question, because we did this with one of the new vaccines that you had heard about, and you were like, there's this thing that's happening, and it sounds really weird and like out
too good
there.
to be true, though. Yeah, there was an article months back about an Omni vaccine that was going to take care of everything, and that'll be it. It's almost completely over, and it's never going to be a problem again. And I was like, V,
Allegedly.
take a look at this.
Right, and so we were like, is this real? Is this a thing? So some things to keep in mind. Always, like you do, Ray, go to that initial source, read through that, see if what the results of that study actually are reflected well. And that's the first step, right? Not only understanding the study yourself, but then going back to that news source that you found it from and seeing, did they accurately talk about this? Maybe the headline was weird because editors get their hands on headlines just to sell things, and that's not a good indicator. But within the article itself, did they seem to understand this study? That's a good thing to know in case you want to go back to that source later for maybe the brief overview of what's going on. Then you have to look at who did the study, who published the study, what else they have done. Like you said, Ray, where the money is coming from, how are they being funded, right? This was, I think, a Nature article initially or something.
Mm-hmm.
And we were like, all right, so let's dive in. Who's writing this, who's researching this, and looking at those individuals' credentials, right? And we found that it seemed pretty legitimate. The person who wrote the article was a high-ranking person in the U.S. military who had been hired for years to write about military studies. So it was like, okay, her credentials seem to work well. Let's go to the scientists. Who are they? What else have they done? Is this their area of expertise?
Mm-hmm.
Did a little research there. Oh, these all are, people who talk about this kind of thing all the time and have done previous studies that are now coming into play. What are the other studies that are being linked, right? And it's this huge task.
They're not like self-styled scientists who graduated from upstairs university.
Or even people in other fields who graduated with whatever degrees they had and are jumping into maybe a field they haven't explored as much or don't have a lot of background in.
Like an engineer wanting to chime in on biology.
Yeah, or like a detective thinking that he's a biblical history scholar or something. So the downside, as you're finding, and as we're saying here, is it takes a lot of work to actually dive into something that most people will just read the headline, maybe the first paragraph of the article, right? And so you are expending a lot of energy and a lot of time into doing something that other people are not doing. The benefit of that is you are then allowing yourself to not fall for the kinds of sensationalism that a lot of the media companies use to sell their stories. And when somebody else does a story on a thing, you already have that background knowledge and you can bring that to the table to evaluate future claims. It progresses, it grows with you. But you also have to make sure you are either have the time for it at all or pick and choose and say, I want to be knowledgeable in these 2 or 3 areas, right? Maybe I really want to know more about COVID. Maybe I really want to know more about trans issues. Maybe I want to know more about like reproductive healthcare. Whatever those areas are, pick that, stick with it. You don't have to be an expert at everything, but just knowing how to find that information is so, so useful.
And I just kind of want to juxtapose that with an example of something that I think a lot of us have seen.
Yeah.
And that is about 20 years ago, then Dr. Andrew Wakefield published a study that linked vaccination with autism. That will get us demonetized.
Yay.
That it turns out that it was not rigorous. It was like a dozen people. There were people that were selected for, and it was systematically debunked later on, and that person wound up becoming disbarred, and it was an entire thing. But it has been linked to and referenced for the last 20 years as justification for some really, really crappy beliefs. And what they should have done is looked at the study. And if they would have seen that it was not rigorous and, what else was there, actually connected with the study, there's a much higher chance that those people would not be as entrenched in those beliefs.
Yeah, and just doing enough research. If somebody was like, "Hey, I did research into Andrew Wakefield," that is going to have a leg up on everything moving forward. Because if anybody brings Wakefield into it as an expert, you can automatically be like, "Oh no, that's no."
This person doesn't know how to vet their sources.
You don't know how to do this, so I'm not listening to this. Right? So it does, as I said, it builds on itself, and you start amassing this knowledge base that will help you more quickly and effectively determine what is true and what isn't. But it is going to take a lot of work. But it also sounds like you're kind of already doing that, and you're already kind of diving in and jumping into the background here.
I do with the science. That's some. Yeah, I just wondered if people agreed with me on that. It's everything apart from the science that I'm less sure because there isn't an equivalent of Google Scholar for politics and the law. And well, maybe there is. Maybe you can help me with that. But I'm not aware of any place you can go and. Well, I suppose if I wanted to know what a specific bill said, I would go on the government website and find it. But I have much less patience for that. They're really long and boring to me, whereas science is interesting to me. So it would be nice to have a news organisation that I could at least think, this will do. For when I can't look into everything, science is more my thing.
That would be
when
nice.
It comes to other things, I want to be able to trust someone to distill the stuff for me a little bit.
Right.
But maybe it might be more realistic to at least recognize what the bias is. So if you're getting it from a source, just recognize that here's the bias that I know that this source presents when it comes to the way that they talk about these things, and make sure that that's applied that way. There was someone in the chat, V, who had a question, who added me for some stupid reason, but Demil MP says you need to teach someone what a good study looks like. What does a good study look like, V?
I am not a scientist. So at that point, it does become up to, it becomes that's the only downside to this, is reading the studies for yourself can get a much better idea, but it's very difficult for a layperson to read a scientific study and be able to determine if this was sufficiently, done correctly or not. A couple of things to look out for, just off the top of my head, very basic. If the sample size of the study is small, anything under, I want to say probably 200, 300 people minimum, there's probably a lot of wiggle room for error there. It could very well be that they find some kind of correlation, some kind of trend, but it wouldn't be enough to make a claim about a general population, which is what a lot of them try to suggest. Another thing is look at when it was published. If this is an old study, a lot of dishonest people will link to studies that have since been debunked. You can see this a lot in things like Answers in Genesis. They will link to studies from the 70s and the 80s and be like, well, look at this impressive paper. It's
because okay, that's the last time someone's agreed with us.
Right. Is there something else that has happened since the 80s in this field that will, shed more light on this topic?
My own government is doing that. It's so frustrating. My own government is doing that with the issue of post-viral chronic illnesses, specifically ME. But now with long COVID, they're trying to apply this horrendous fraudulent, it wasn't just mistaken, there's evidence of actual fraud in this study that the government paid for. The Work and Pensions Department, back then it was called that, paid for these scientists who were basically psychologists, who weren't even doctors, to do this study, where it was really dishonestly done, to suggest that all people with ME needed was exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy, completely ignoring all the evidence of blood clotting and stuff. It was called the PACE, P-A-C-E, a trial. It's notorious. If you look it up, there's so much been written about it, and they're still trying to drag it out and rehabilitate it. And there's so much financial interest in it. The government basically doesn't want, anyway, sorry, that's gone off on a bit of a tangent maybe, but that's just another example. You can't even trust your own government because they've got their own agendas in terms of which studies they look for.
Right.
They have hired scientists who have been shown to be dishonest just because those scientists say the fringe view that they want, specifically about illnesses. Because we have a national healthcare system and the Conservative Party hates it, they just want any excuse to take people's financial support away. So that's one of the reasons I got into looking at the science so much, is I wanted to know, like you say, ADHD, there's a whole shocking example about that, which was about 10 years ago, I remember. There were loads of headlines all copying each other. They didn't seem to have read the study themselves. It was everywhere. BBC, like big news outlets everywhere, had the headline, ADHD medication has no long-term effectiveness, along those lines. And what the study actually showed was that when you took teenagers off of their Ritalin, they lost the benefits of the Ritalin they'd been on.
What?
It was
Oh my God.
basically the equivalent of saying we took some type 1 diabetics off their insulin, they all died, therefore insulin has no long-term effectiveness.
Yeah.
That's literally the logic that they applied. And Fox News in particular actually had an expert come and talk about it. But what they did was they took snippets of what he said, only showed a small amount, and allowed it to look like he was agreeing with them. And then he had to make a YouTube video to say, no, this is what I actually said. This is how the study's been misrepresented. And now here's how I've been misrepresented. It's just a shocking example of that, I think. But yeah,
No,
ADHD
exactly.
is often victim of that because it can be sensationalized so easily. But it used to be this big scare thing of they're over diagnosing it, over medicating. That was the big story. So any study that came out had that bias in it.
Exactly. Which is why you don't want to only look for the papers that are being published. Even if they're getting it wrong, there's a reason they chose those specifically, right? They factor into some kind of larger social narrative, what's being talked about right now. And a lot of the time, the truth, for lack of a better term here, the interesting thing, the thing that's going to really make a difference, are the things that aren't actively being talked about because they are more complex or because they are not sensational in and of themselves, but they are another building block, perhaps a very important one in a much longer term study. So those are a couple of things. The last one I would say is to make sure you're not looking at, there are a lot of studies that talk about meta-analyses and self-reports. So people who are being surveyed for things, unless it's a very specific type of study where they're actively controlling for the bias within the reporting, it is going to always be questionable to make any kind of accurate assumption about a group based on their self-reported either experiences or worldviews or emotional state. All of that always needs to be taken with that grain of salt, that this is people talking about themselves, and we are notoriously bad at actually understanding the truth about ourselves and what actually makes us tick. So those are the three for me.
I want to highlight that a little bit. I know, and then I know we got to go.
We do need to wrap up.
When it comes to self-reporting, there are a lot of people who just don't know how to sample, and so there are universities that will do studies but not account for the fact that the people that they're getting involved are university students, which means that you're not getting an accurate reflection of a general population. You're only able to make inferences about the population that you are sampling from. Also, just remember that the higher number when it comes to sampling, the lower the margin of error. So if you have a very small sample size and you come to a conclusion, the margin of error can be huge, all the way up to it not being true. And so the higher you get when it comes to studying a population, the more data that you get, the more you can shrink that margin of error and be able to have more confidence in what the conclusion is, so long as it's being done appropriately.
Yeah.
But that said, yeah, we've been on this call for a while.
This is definitely an area I love talking about. I think that it's useful for this audience and for people in this sphere of YouTube to think about a lot, because we're all trigger happy with that retweet button. We all are. We just proved that Christians are less smart than atheists. Retweet. Yeah, it's like, it's not gonna.
I hop on Twitter and I got added by about 500 people, and it's just like, why are you adding me?
But we just always want to make sure that we're doing what Ray's doing and giving things that extra little bit of attention when we can, and understanding that there is no one source of truth. Ray, thank you so much for calling in. You got us on a wonderful tangent, and we're so happy you got to talk to you.
I was so happy too. Thank you.
Bye.
Somebody said, what does EN stand for? England.
I don't think it actually does stand for England.
Well, I'm the one who's typing it in. So today it stands for England.
Today it stands for Speaking of being accurate.